Hello, do you hear me well? Guys, immediately after this Q&A session, we will stay there up to the 10 p.m. And after that, I might suggest you to move in and proceed further in after party. It will take place in Mannequin Peace. Do you know this place? It will be Moskovsky Prospect 198. So guys, I'm wondering if you might join us and we'll be on the after party. Okay?
So, let's make it a little bit interactive. So, who will join us? Raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 4 shots. 4 shots, okay. Any other guys?
This one.
Yeah, I see you. I remember. It means yes, okay. And one more thing before we start our second part. It's very valuable for us to get a feedback from you. So feedback forms are on that table. So when you have time, please just step it nearby, and there are a lot of pens and forms. Just form it where we really need what themes are actual for you, which we are working on, and because we need to define a context for our next meetings. Thank you. So let's get back to the second phase. I heard a lot of pretty much questions about Terraform in general in the break. So
Do you want me to go up there?
yeah, so we can just make. Okay, let's start from question and answer, and then maybe we just transform it to something else. So who will be next?
I have a question about a recent issue. In the AWS provider, right, in Terraform. So this issue is about spot instances. You're probably well aware of it.
Maybe.
Yeah. Is there any plan to fix it in the near future?
Can you be a bit more specific?
More specific about the issue. Yeah, of course. So as far as I understand the issue, when the providers used to launch spot instances, and in the process of usage, spot instance prices changed, and the spot instance is shut down. Then Terraform cannot perform any other actions because it sees that the instance is not available anymore. And basically, when you try to say apply some differences, they don't work anymore. So and Terraform throws an error when trying to apply such a modified plan. So this is basically what I know about the issue.
I don't know that much about that issue. I know we were dealing with a very similar issue in the packet provider recently. And I thought the AWS works differently to what you described, because there is like spot fleet and then there is spot instance. And I thought in both cases that you basically create the request and that stays there in the API, and that says that's basically the overlap. There's the overlay about the EC2 API, which actually launches the instances. So I thought this shouldn't be happening in AWS, but I don't have much details about that particular issue. So I would need to know the number of the issue, the ID or something. Yeah, we generally try to avoid or prevent people from managing like ephemeral things like spot instances, unless the API offers you the way to do that in a way that basically holds the placeholder for like a request, which does the scheduling then. So you should not be using Terraform to directly schedule things that will disappear on purpose. So if you're saying that's the way the API works, then the solution will probably be removing the resource. I'm maybe a bit too harsh, but like Terraform has a way to deal with conflicts, including the conflict when someone deletes a resource outside of Terraform's context. But that's there as a let's say to catch errors or unexpected situations. It's not there to like to do anything like this, like to just schedule an instance and expect it to be gone. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, thank you to Radek. So who's next? I know I have seen that.
Could you please clarify why your team use Go for developing Terraform? Any reason? Is it historical or something else?
Why do we use Go for
Yeah.
Terraform? So I wasn't around in HashiCorp when the decision was made, but I think it was a safe bet for HashiCorp to bet on Go. We use that for pretty much all open source tools except Vagrant and except some of our enterprise offerings. And one of the reasons, there is a couple of reasons why we use that. Everybody has different reasons, obviously, but my reasons would be easy cross compilation, so statically compiled binaries. Then you know fairly simple, easy to follow syntax, which it's much more difficult to write bad code in Go, in my opinion. You can always write bad code, very sort of dirty code, but I think it's much more difficult. I like the fact that in Go you can't even compile the code until it complies with certain things, like it's very similar to Python in some ways, because in Python you also have to have whitespaces in certain places. It's part of the syntax, which I like personally. What else? Let's see. There are things I don't like about Go, obviously, but out of the all, it's good about Go has very good mechanisms for dealing with concurrency and how to run certain things in parallel, which we leverage in Terraform. So when you see the output from apply, when it's doing all the sending all the API requests, then we can parallelize all of the API requests and do it very efficiently. So it's very efficient. It does very efficient garbage collection as well. I don't know what else. It's probably half a dozen of reasons.
Also, I have one more question about HCL. For you have JSON. Why your team use HCL? One mentioned that it's not really a good idea from my side.
Yeah, I thought I explained that on one of the slides. What solution would you choose, just so I can?
I think that it's possible to use JSON to describe to describe the same things.
No, because of comma control is awful in JSON.
Yeah, you can't have trailing commas, and more importantly, you can't have comments in JSON. If you get to build out your infrastructure and it gets very larger and larger, and you get into templating, then you realize that JSON is you can use JSON, but your configs will get longer and longer, and suddenly you realize that you need some bits to be reused across some configs, unless you're fancy doing copy paste, which is usually not a good idea. You end up using a templating engine like Jinja or something to generate the JSON. So suddenly you're using an overlay above the language.
So, by the way, we have JSON 5. Why not use it?
Give me such questions.
Because they use
So there is, HCL is JSON compatible. So if you really fancy using JSON, you can do that. And you can still leverage all other parts of Terraform, which give you the abstraction layers above the APIs and the CRUD, basically. So you don't have to use HCL in order to use Terraform. I probably won't give you that many arguments about HCL and JSON because first, I don't have a CS degree to tell you the differences between the, I didn't design HCL in the first place. I think it's a good idea, personally, because there is the gap between data languages and the high-level languages, and I think it just makes sense to me. But I might not be as involved in the process as I'm also not part of the core team, which works on language. So that's all I can tell, I guess.
It's clear for me.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Thank you for your phone. I would like to ask you about VMware support and if it will be official or something.
Yes, so I think it's 1 or 2 months ago that we hired a guy from Canada actually to work just be dedicated to VMware and vSphere. I think I'm not that familiar with VMware land, but I think there's a couple of different VMware APIs, right? There's the vCloud Director and vSphere and maybe something else, I don't know. But I know he's focusing on VMware, and I think we are going to make it sort of officially supported. I think that provider should eventually reach 1.0 as well. That's like we started bumping most of the providers to 1.0 just to acknowledge the fact that we follow semantic versioning. But there is a few exceptions, and VMware is one of them because we don't want to tell people that just go and use it in the wild because VMware will need to go through some significant breaking changes, I think. And it's probably there's a lot of missing functionality there. That's as far as I'm aware. I'm not that involved in the VMware provider, so yeah, we certainly have an employee of HashiCorp working on VMware.
Is VMware supporting?
That would be great if it did. So we have partnerships with many vendors like AWS and Google. So Google supports us very well. They basically have 4 full-time employees, like Google engineers, that work with us on HashiCorp tools. So 2 that work on Terraform only, on the GCP provider. And I think 2 others that work on Vault, which is the GCP or the Kubernetes integration with Vault. So, we have partnerships with many vendors. I don't really see too much into the details of other partnerships, but it would be great if it worked that way.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for your question. So, question 1.
Okay, hello. So you've seen how the management of multiple Terraform clusters is inconvenient. So how Kubernetes clusters is inconvenient. How Terraform can help me manage many clusters and basically copy them between. So I have several copies of one infrastructure of different clusters or something like that without any manual kubectl switches or basically specify an array of Kubernetes resources.
It sounds more like Kubernetes question to me.
Yeah, well, not counting the federation of Kubernetes.
I don't have an answer to that, honestly, because even though I was part of the operations team before for a short while, we didn't really run a Kubernetes cluster in production, so I don't know how people deal with that. So I don't really have an answer. Sorry.
Okay, who's next? Question.
First of all, thank you. It was a very good presentation, and I have a simple question: how we should manage sensitive data like passwords in Terraform,
that's gonna come up.
and if there are any changes about it in the future?
Right. So just to give some background to others, if you have any sensitive data in your configs, then basically what Terraform does as it applies all changes, it records the state of the resources so that it can reference the IDs and knows what to update in the future. And that state is by default saved locally, but you're encouraged to store it remotely if you work in a team. If you have any sensitive data like initial passwords for databases, then those go into the state as well. And there are currently no ways to say, I want to hash this password, or I want to encrypt it with GPG or something, unless it's implemented on the resource level. And so that's why we recommend that people store, at least encrypt the data at rest. So for example, if you use the remote storage like S3, and you enable encryption there, and that way, at least you're encrypting it at rest. And I think from 0.9 or 0.10, Terraform should not be saving a local copy of the state anymore if you have enabled the remote state. So basically, that should avoid the secret sprawl on your workstations at least. And generally, I think I would recommend if you treat your state file as a unit in terms of sensitivity, then that's the best way to treat it. So let's say you don't put all your databases in the same config file because one database may be used by one team, so you need to expose perhaps some sensitive data in there to one team, and then another sensitive data in the same config to another team. So it's best to split that in terms of state files.
You mean to have several state files?
Correct. So there are ways you can reference the state files as well.
And are there any plans to do something with it in the future?
Yes, we certainly discussed this, and we want to address that. But it's, as far as I'm aware, it's not on the nearest few months roadmap. There are some other more important things that are on the near-term roadmap.
Thank you.
Okay. I already have a question. I have a question. Couple of minutes for you.
So actually, Radek, I have asked this question you previously. If you deal with multiple environments, and you mentioned workspaces, yeah, and I didn't remember conditional or how it's actually called. When you, for example, you have one definition by default, and you set this variable, and for example, for prod, we will stay and choose this one. And if you have more than two environments in real environments, in real infrastructure, how it's better to deal with it? Previously, we used TFF. It's another open source solution for switching and dealing with multiple states file and other things. But it's not so good to write the same code 4 or even more times. Maybe here's the best solution.
So I know that some users, some organizations are defining the variables. They have tf-vars file where they have all of the environment-specific stuff. I'm not sure if you can actually load dfvars file per environment. Maybe you can't. Well, but either way, if the workspaces, which were previously called environments, aren't flexible enough for you, then there is still the old way of doing environments, or the separation of state. And that's basically having separate directories with your configs and use modules to create reusable pieces of config, basically. And just reference it by exposing it as a module. And then you can have dfvars in each directory, which represents variables specific to your environment.
So, and store log files, so
Store what?
log files per environment. Then.
Log files.
Yeah. It was the main issue, not state, but different state
I
of log
see.
files.
Yes. So in that case, you would store a log file per environment.
In each directory.
Well, you should do that remotely. But yes, it would be per environment, per directory.
And yeah.
So one environment per one directory.
Yeah. And another question: if we are dealing with multiple accounts in AWS, and for multiple enterprise companies, they have more than one AWS account, how it's better to switch them and have similar infrastructure across different accounts?
I think you can use the approach that I just described. If you have, this is the case when it gets probably a lot more complicated to use workspaces, or maybe impossible even to use workspaces, because you can't use variables and interpolation in the remote state block, I think. So that's the reason why, that's certainly something we want to address and support. It's not like you're not doing anything wrong. It's just that, you will get there. It makes sense to have different AWS account per environment. That's what people do. But we don't quite support that in workspaces, because you need to do early interpolation, which you quite can't. So just use different directories and have separate variables file in each, and use modules. So then in each directory you would have basically one file, the tf config, which is only the module reference, and then you just fill in the gaps, basically the differences between between your environments, if that makes any sense.
So yeah. Also.
So you would have a module which says like my whole environment, or you would have multiple modules for, let's say, what are the most common differences between environments? There may be more differences than, it depends, how it differs really. Because in our case, when I was working for timing, I know we had very similar networks, so all that differed between networks, meaning like the VPC, subnets, etc., was just the network CIDRs, so the address subnets. So the IP space, and then therefore we were exposing different like VPC IDs or subnet IDs, and that was the unit. So that was the module that we had like reusable in between environments, in between directories. But then it's up to up to you really. It depends how else your environment differs.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, now it's your turn.
I have a couple of questions. First of all, if we have a split configuration of Terraform, as an example, we have some core states in one project, like VPC, subnets, security groups, etc. And other projects, like small environments, a couple of instances, elastic load balancer, and we have two remote states in this environment project. One remote state for the core project and one remote state for this small environment itself. And for example, we would like to test some new Terraform version. And when we make plan, we'll Terraform rewrite to Terraform remote states as in for the local project as for the core project. Is there any way to test this breaking before we would like to roll back?
So I think until very recently, plan was, because plan does the refresh as well, plan was changing the state file, but that's not the case since 0.8, I think. So you can run plan, you should be able to run plan safely without modifying, so it doesn't modify your state. Which means, because we record the Terraform version in the state as well, which basically which means that once you use the new version of Terraform on that state file, you can't downgrade unless you manually modify things, which is generally not a good idea. So is there a way to test it safely? If you have a dev environment, which generally should have a separate state file, then do it that way. I don't know if that answers your question, but...
So, as I understand, you try apply, and Terraform you update test state file for the environment and for the core.
No, Terraform, since 0.8, if you have any version that's past 0.8, I think, that's the version, then plan won't make any changes in the state file. It will only display you the plan, and it will generate the plan on the fly in the memory. It will generate the plan and the state file. But only once you apply that plan, then that will be recorded back to the state file. And the new version of Terraform will be also recorded there. So, yeah. I think, though, that there should be less and less reasons why you would desperately need to upgrade Terraform as in the core, because since the provider split, the more common reasons why people would do any upgrade in general is to get more features that we released in the provider line, and that you can do fairly safely, I think. So you don't. I don't think it even gets recorded in the state file, like the version of the provider. So you can upgrade providers fairly independently of the core. So if you're keen on upgrading providers, that should be fairly safe.
We'll test on Terraform at least. The second question. You have modules that stores Git.
Can you speak a bit louder?
We have modules that store in Git, and in some project we use this module couple of times. As an example, a module that describes how instance should be deployed, and we deploy a couple of instances using this module. The problem is, if I change this module, I have to apply changes to this project. I have to remove .terraform directory, run terraform init. For each module usage, I have to type username and password for the Git. And only after that I could make a plan.
Right, I see. So could you? I think that's more of a generic problem when you're dealing with Git repositories in any way, like anywhere. We use GoGetter, which is an internal HashiCorp library that we wrote and use in Terraform and elsewhere to basically take any kind of URL and pull down the contents from there that works for both Git and any other VCS and S3, etc. And I think if you have Git URLs throughout your configs and you don't want to go through that situation again and again, like filling out credentials, then I think the reason it asks you for the credentials in the first place is because you use HTTPS. Am I right?
Yes, you are right. And I tried to add to the source.
So I would say, so is there any reason why you can't use the SSH protocol?
Source doesn't support variables. I could solve this problem just by adding to this repeat URL username and password by variables. So I would be asked to type those two variables. I type in and rebuild.
So yeah, I know separate interpolation in there, but I don't think it's a good idea to, I don't know, there may be a valid reason why you do that, but I would suggest that you take a look into SSH, really using SSH, because in that case you can use some like SSH agent, for example, or you can generally have your private key stored somewhere, which will be loaded automatically, so you don't have to enter the credentials every single time. So that should work out of the box, I think. That's what I do personally. If I don't enter my credentials on every single clone that I do on my machine, because it just loads my SSH key.
We couldn't use SSH as this couldn't be approved by our security managers. So Git and SSH is not okay in the security.
I would understand that Git protocol is not allowed because that's, yeah, I would understand that, but why?
I would say.
So by the way, so is that because port 22 is not allowed on your firewall?
No. As an example, we have a project that is accessible via SSH. So all users that access this project are accessing by using one SSH user. And this SSH user on Git just have authorized key file with all user keys. So they are all logged in to Git via SSH using one account or different keys. So just one user can.
Well, yeah. So yeah, you would have to have account per developer, I guess. I mean, you do have accounts per developer, assuming that every one of your developers is entering different credentials, then you already have an account for them, right?
So I don't understand. So could we repeat this? Only one. By design, we just bought a company and they have Git installation and it was the way that they work. We have a lot of tool set that would work only with such a Git.
So they have one shared user. Is that what you're saying?
They have one account, one Git account, and multiple their personal accounts with keys. And this Git account have those developers' keys. It's the REST keys.
I see.
So each user connects to Git using his own SSH keys.
Yep.
But on the Git, the user is always the same one.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, understood.
That's why this configuration is not secure.
I think that's a bit like misunderstanding of how the protocol works, but because you're authorizing yourself as using the private key, right?
Yeah.
So you're a different user since you present a different private key.
But this type of key usage doesn't follow security compliance that we have to follow. That's why we could not use SSH or Git.
That's interesting.
So in our company, SSH keys are not allowed.
It's an interesting decision. Yeah, this is being recorded, right?
Let's ask guys who have on screen. So, you have a question? No? One more from here. Thank you. So just keep the microphone close to your mouth.
Okay. Could you please say, maybe in general, what is the difference between enterprise version of Terraform and community vision, and which benefits could we get by buying the enterprise? Could we get some support in complex cases where Terraform developers assistance needed to troubleshoot our conflicts? That could be this goal could be achieved.
So Terraform Enterprise makes the most sense for bigger teams, I would say, because it offers some features on top of Terraform, like approval process and integrations with Slack, for example, or HipChat, and it gives you a nice UI on top of integrated with GitHub, basically. So whenever you whenever you merge whenever you actually open a PR, it runs the plan for you and reports back the plan was as green or red as a status to the PR. So it should be applicable without any issues. And then you can merge the PR, and then it runs the actual plan again from master in Atlas, and you get to do the approval, and you can comment on anything in Atlas, Terraform Enterprise. And what else do we have there? Yeah, you get the notifications in Slack as well. So whenever someone whenever someone merges the PR, you can actually approve it straight from Slack, for example. What else? You can have there's probably a lot more features which I can't remember. Because that's simply because I work mainly on the open source part. It's not just there is a team that works with us, but the enterprise offering is technologically different. So we work with each other, but like it's a UI job mostly. So it's like just you get a really nice UI in the workflow, which covers you from the beginning till the end, till production basically. So you don't have to build your own workflow around Terraform. You get, you used to get the locking as well, which is now part of Terraform, but you might still need some kind of bits and pieces around Terraform to make it safe to use in bigger teams. So that's what Terraform Enterprise gives you.
Okay. We are almost run out of time, but we've got time for a couple more questions. So, anyone else willing to ask?
If you're interested to hear more about the Terraform Enterprise, or you're thinking about buying it, then I would certainly recommend filling out the form on the website, and someone will get in touch.
Yeah, and as far as I know, one of your main office are in California, in San Francisco, so it's really close to your headquarters. So you can just go and visit them. Nothing special. Maybe it will be the opposite case. They will visit you and describe Terraform Enterprise in detail. For your operations director, for Dima, for example. So I think it's pretty easy. Okay, let me encourage you. So we've got special stickers for our meetup. So I will grant it for everybody who asked questions. So let me start, and other guys can think a little bit. So
give more stickers to the guy who helped me during the demo.
Yeah, but I can't see him. Yeah, this one was. No. And who helped you, by the way? Also me. Will be the second one.
I actually have some other product stickers as well. I need to save some for tomorrow, but...
Okay, so anyone else would like to trust you?
Does anyone want a Terraform sticker?
Yeah, the special Terraform stickers.
Sure. Do you want? We have priority.
I think everybody wants.
Oh, the difference.
I
have a question.
It doesn't matter. Here are stickers, so. One for me. Radek.
I'm just thinking about what will you describe the worst possible workflow for Terraform and Kubernetes?
Worst possible workflow. Wow.
Destroy everything.
That's a good question. I mean, worst case scenario or worst possible workflow? Because workflow, I can think of one workflow. I can't think of a bad workflow.
Ben will go to.
I don't know. The worst case scenario that may happen in Terraform in general is that you will lose track of your resources. But there is a way to recover from that. Well, first of all, you should store your state remotely. That's the sort of long-term solution for the future, so it doesn't happen again. But you still have tools in place to import resources back. So you can use the import functionality, which will basically record the state of the resource as if you created it through Terraform. That's all I can think of.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so looks like the time is up. We've got 10 or 15 minutes. So thank you for coming. Thank you, Radek.
Thank you for coming. Thank you all for coming.
For the interesting question, it was a great discussion. So let me remind you that it's really important for us to get a feedback from you, and feedback forms are over there. So let's say thank you, Radek, once again.